Guests duly introduced by fellows beg to leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London on Thursday, 10th November 2022. Professor Martin Millett, President in the Chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 3rd November 2022 were read and signed. This being a meeting for the election of new fellows, the President announced the following were elected: Thomas Booth, Linda Brady, Matthew Brudenell, Christy Constanta, I've probably got that wrong, Christy Constanta, Matthew Davies, Thomas Delmar, Alistair Douglas, Christopher Edwards, Ken Eamon, Devin Fitzgerald, Anna Garnett. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society and ordered to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Migration, Mobility and Demography in Later Prehistoric Britain by Professor Ian Arnott, FSA. Thanks for return to this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, 17th November 2022, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as true and complete record? Following the results of today's ballot, I declare the following are duly elected Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London: Toby Jones, Christina Kraczewicz, John Lee, Tamsin O'Connell, Susanna Paul, Miliana Radinjic, Laura Ratcliffe Warren, Mark Reagan, Stin Van Rosen, Ethan Wottrell, Robin Walker. Certificates.
7 certificates today. Murray Andrews, BSc, MA, PhD, Post-Excavation Project Officer with Headland Archaeology with expertise in medieval coin hoards. Richard Ansell, BA, MA, DPhil, a scholar of early modern travel history and literature with a particular interest in the materiality of travel texts. Richard Bennett, BA, MA, MRes, established breaking ground heritage to enable military veterans to access heritage projects and also to assess well-being efficacy in archaeology projects. Penelope Bickle, PhD, Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at the University of York. Wendy Bishop, BA, BSc, MA, PhD, a landscape history consultant specializing in ornamental lakes. James G. Clark, BA, MA, DPhil, Professor at the History at the University of York, specializing in religion, culture, and intellectual life in later medieval and Reformation England. And Mike Anthony Collins, BA, Team Leader, Development Advice, Historic England, Northeastern Yorkshire region.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our lecturers this evening are Paula Ware, who is the Fellow and Director of MAP Archaeological Practice based in Malton, North Yorkshire. Early in her career, she worked on archives of some of the distinguished excavators of Northern England: Tony Brewster, Calder, Kerr, and Tony Pasito. With the development of developer-funded archaeology in the 1990s, she transferred to commercial archaeological work, and for the last 30 years or so has worked on some of the major sites in the region, working recently in York and on chariot burials in East Yorkshire and the Eastfield site that we're hearing about this evening. Pete Wilson Fellow, having worked a long career in English heritage, historic England, including as the head of research policy for Roman archaeology, is now an independent consultant. He graduated from Birmingham University, obtained a PhD from Bradford on the Roman North with focus on Yorkshire, published very widely on Roman archaeology, including the says from here, major monograph, monstrously major monograph on Catterick, published in 2002, drawing together all the early work from that site. More recently, work on Cawthorne Camps and Malton. He's interests include work on the Roman army, Roman native interaction, and Roman urban sites, particular reference to the north. And we're to hear from Paula and Pete this evening, a paper, An Unexpected Complex of Roman Buildings, Eastfield, Scarborough. Welcome.
Good evening, President, fellows and guests. Tonight we're going to be talking about an unexpected site. When I say unexpected, it had been part of the planning process, and trial trenching had indicated that we were going to get a native Iron Age Romano-British site, but fortunately for us, things changed quite dramatically. But I'll go through the history of where we were with the site and how we ended up where we are now. Eastfield is just south of Scarborough, located in North Yorkshire, and the Roman sites that were known about are the Filey, the signal stations, both at Scarborough and Filey, possible Roman fort, harbour at Bridlington, the fort obviously at Malton, the Stamford Bridge settlement, and obviously York and Hayton in the area. This is a view looking across to the site. And the site is on this promontory, the highest area that you can see, and that's looking across the Vale of Pickering. The two key elements of the site are firstly the prominent landscape position, which would have been an important feature dominating the eastern end of the Vale of Pickering. This site that commanded the surrounding area and would have been noticeable to anyone passing through the landscape. The second feature that needs to be considered when we consider the role of the site is the role of water. The many ditches and water features and the failure of some of these features may have affected the viability and possibly lead to the demise of the site in the late Roman period. The site needs to be put in its wider historical concept landscape. Mesolithic, the internationally important site of SocAntiquaries is just located here. This is the Eastfield site. So we're in close proximity to the site. Iron Age and Romano-British settlements are located at Hayton, the site here at Raincliffe, Wycombe, and the fort at Staxton. In the early 2000s, this is a relatively new site. We were commissioned to do geophysical survey, thinking it was part of their scheduled ancient monument of the hospital, medieval hospital. But in fact, what actually turned out from the geophysics, that there was a Roman fort field. It's part of the scheduled ancient monument. And the landowner at the time was considering putting more caravans on. So there was always this potential that we would be able to do some trial trenching. Unfortunately, he's decided not to go ahead with that. But this is a really interesting site. And it's an undated Roman fort that has just sort of now been recently commented on and people made aware of. So that's the background in terms of the Roman archaeology. There's a potential unexcavated villa at Brompton, which is a nearby village just here. And obviously the signal station, Scarborough and Filey, all add up to the intensity of activity in the period. Geology. The land slopes gradually from its northern edge at the height of some 75 metres to about 55 metres. The solid geology within the area is calcareous grit, and the northern part is oolitic limestone and sandstone, with a band of oolitic and coral rag along the southern boundary, and some mudstone within the northern part of the Deepdale. Towards the base of Deepdale, the lower calcareous grit has been eroded to expose the underlying Oxford clay. Superficial deposits of glacial till, predominantly gravel and clay, overlay the solid geology across the majority of the site. The soils are primarily fine loamy soils of the Birmingham II Association. Eastville is a modern post-war housing estate situated within Scarborough Civil Parish and Scarborough Borough of North Yorkshire. The overall development area is 46 hectares, divided between High Eastfield, HA1, and HA2, as you can see, under development. It's west of the village of Osgoodby and south of the new Eastway Link Road. The land has been allocated for housing, and indeed many of the properties are already constructed and not occupied. There's been several phases of excavations. The first excavation started in HA2, HA1 here, and you can see the mitigation. We have areas of excavation, the pink areas, watch and brief yellow areas, and strip map and record the blue areas. Archaeological work was undertaken at the site from 2009 to the present day. The initial work included geophysical survey and 111 trial trenches, which confirmed a late Iron Age Romano-British washing line enclosure settlement on site and associated enclosures, which aligned trackways for both areas HA1 and HA2. The information allowed a suitable mitigation to be devised for the site prior to construction. It's in hindsight that we look at the trial trenches, and they were all strategically placed to avoid the complex of buildings. Outline planning permission for the development was granted by Scarborough Borough Council in September 2012, with numerous reserved matters applications as development progressed. Neither of HA1 or 2 excavations have been completed, as they've only been undertaken in advance of each phase of development. So HA2, where we still have quite a lot of work to be undertaken in this area, we've been told will be in the next few years, but with no dates. 2 phases of excavation in HA2 have been undertaken, and it has established a sequence of activity over 6,000 years. The Mesolithic period at the site is represented by residual flint implements and flakes, but it must be stressed that there are no contemporary deposits or features. The flint appears to span the entire Mesolithic period, ranging from a possible Upper Paleolithic shoulder point to a microlith from the Mesolithic early Neolithic transition. So clearly a wide time span for early activity is evidenced at the site. With the Mesolithic type site of Starcart and the associated landscape of Lake Flixton lying just 2.8 kilometres from the site. The Mesolithic flint assemblage does have wider landscape significance. The earliest recorded archaeological evidence for occupation within the development site dates to the Neolithic. We have several pits within the period with Neolithic pottery, but the most that we can say in terms of the enclosures starts to materialise in the Middle Iron Age, with 3 barrows at HA2 belonging to Helkins Group 1, relatively large barrows. They had no surviving primary graves. The rounded form of Barrow 1 is slightly anomalous, as it's been recognised in other excavated cemeteries, such as at Burnby Lane and Pocklington. Although by no means tightly clustered, the 3 barrows were all in the southern-eastern area of HA2, with Barrow 2 and Barrow 3 outside the areas that were later enclosed, and Barrow 1 assimilated into a later enclosure, situated downhill from the others. It's possible that the barrows represent a dispersed Iron Age funerary zone centred on the ridge at the south of the site. See these enclosures here, facing the Neolithic from this area, and then the Middle Iron Age barrows, and late Iron Age features start this enclosure. Although square barrows are primarily associated with the Yorkshire Wolds, there are many examples on the tabular hills and northern fringes of the Vale of Pickering, with, for instance, a chariot burial in a square barrow at Pexton Moor to the west, a chariot from Seamer Station, a square barrow incorporated into a later enclosure system at Crossgates, and southwest of the site, another isolated square barrow excavated at Seamer in 2019. The Deepdale barrows represent more evidence of the presence of this rite outside the core area of the Wolds, and are worthy of further study, as there is potential for them to be boundary markers. Contemporary with the barrows in HA2 were the remains of 2 early trackways, including some surfacing remains, an early northwest to southwest boundary ditch, which later became the northern boundaries of the enclosure complex, as well as a number of roundhouses or ring gullies, excavated evidence suggests that part of the trackway consisted of 3 elements of construction, which were better preserved at the northern end of the site. The latest phase of construction consisted of large cobbles, representing infill repair, perhaps a response to ruts caused by cartwheels. The northern boundary element of the site was incorporated into the later enclosure complex, illustrated by the later ditch segment, which intersected it. A lack of early material evidence within the fills suggests the boundary ditches were continually reinstated throughout the period. The roundhouses were established in this phase with the material evidence suggesting the ring gullies served as strip gullies and were regularly maintained and cleaned out. The lack of artefacts recovered from within the roundhouse fills suggested they remained in use until the later phases of enclosure and were only backfilled when they were replaced by later stone structures. Some of the other smaller partial ring gullies perhaps represented hayracks or fodder pens rather than roundhouses. It's clear that the Iron Age landscape boundaries acted as spines on which the first group of enclosures were laid over to create the enclosure complex. This seems to occur around the same time as the Roman conquest, judging by the material recovered from the ditch fills. Initially, only 2 enclosures were completely enclosed during this early period. The apparent flourishing in activity on site during the mid to late 4th century is characterised by the establishment of a number of structures represented by either sunken floored buildings or hollows, which appear to have been positioned to almost certainly take advantage of some of the extant enclosures on site. Although the structures were poorly preserved and severely robbed, they no doubt represent either sunken floor buildings or unroofed hollows because they were characteristically similar to others identified elsewhere. The buildings were single-storey structures, sub-square in plan, and probably built with stone walls, with some tentative evidence of central post holes to support the roof and cobbled floors. The environmental material derived from buildings in HA2 consisted of large concentrations of cereal grain and thick heather roots.
Thank you, Paula. To turn to the Roman complex, which is part of HA1, the western part of the development area. Paula's already pointed out the topographic location in broad terms, with behind the site, the highest point in the local area, Oliver's Mount, being a significant feature. The site itself, which we're going to be concentrating on now, is located on a promontory which extends out slightly into the Vale of Pickering, making it locally a very distinct location. The site, as we know it, has northern and southern boundaries, but they extend, or at least we think original northern and southern boundaries, north there, south here, but then obviously extends beyond them. Paul has already alluded to the fact there'll be more work done in the eastern part of the area, HA2, but also there is a potential in the future for development to the north of the site we're talking about now. So we may learn more about what's going on to the north of the area we're talking about. The site, but the area within the enclosure walls is about 80 meters square, although the enclosure is somewhat trapezoidal. I can't even say it. But a significant fact is that since the Roman period, there's been significant plough damage to the site, and the ploughing appears to extend from northwest to southeast. And this has meant that as the site in the Roman period was consisted of a series of artificial terraces which have been created to put the buildings on, we're seeing poor preservation on the southeast edge of each of the terraces, with better preservation where the terrace provides protection the northern part to the northern part of the building. Hence, we have a terrace running through here, and we lost. These buildings are incredibly poorly preserved, as you'll see later. But this area is relatively protected. At the southern end of this terrace, these buildings here are less well preserved. And again, a further terrace with better preservation here, poorer preservation to the south. So what I'm going to do is take you on a tour of the site, starting with the most poorly preserved buildings, and finishing with the better preserved ones. But what I ought to do at this point is acknowledge the significant help we've received from Professor Dominic Powsland, who has been droning the site for us on a regular basis and also has created a number of extremely useful 3D models from his photographic work. But also significant in terms of our understanding of the site is that Historic England understandably have decided the site is worthy of protection as a scheduled monument. So we were restricted in what we could do. Throughout, you're going to hear me say, well, we weren't able to take the walls out to get sealed dating evidence. So there are major holes in our understanding, but the price that's the price we pay for preserving what is, and I hope you'll agree by the end of this talk, a unique complex. So next slide. We are starting in the southeast corner of the site here. So I shall go backwards. We're starting on the northern part of the site here. I'm looking at the inset slide, which tells me what's coming up next. The northern building here lies beyond the boundary. Is of two phases, but as you one timber replaced in stone. But as you can see, it is not well preserved. It's close to the edge of a terrace. Where we have cut features, they survive well. Where we have walls, they survive poorly. But we do have two collapsed gable walls here and here. But in both cases, the preservation is because they have the fallen face of the wall has compacted into the underlying soil, which is obviously been soft enough to allow it to effectively to sink. Here we have a very large pit of unknown function, but it sits in a key location under the building. It has produced very little in the way of finds. At this end, the preservation of the gable wall is less because it's fallen on a hard surface, but we were able to reconstruct, be able to suggest that the walls were at least 4 meters high at the gables, and certainly we think more, but that is all the preservation allows us to say. The even more extreme is, as an example, is this building here, building 23, which survives as the bottom of the foundation trenches defined by red clay. No stonework in the foundation survives. The building has been completely erased from the archaeological record otherwise. So this is relatively good preservation, but we will see better. Now, we are starting in the southeast corner of the site. This massive building, at least 30 meters long, and again of 2 phases, is built against one of the boundary walls, so at least it is in its second phase. It is extended to up to the boundary wall. What it also shows in this slide, which is important, is a trackway which was established in the late Iron Age, predating the Roman site, but continuing in use through most, if not all, of the Roman period. This trackway comes up from areas which were developed prior to any archaeological intervention and sweeps across the site to the northeast. And we can see traces of it in areas we have excavated since this photograph mosaic was created, and appears to be running up towards in the direction of Oliver's Mount. Oliver's Mount, as I say, is a local landmark. We don't know what its history is. We know very little about it, other than the fact it's meant to be in a position of a Civil War battery. It now has a motor racing circuit on it, and is not exactly amenable to archaeological investigation. So we're open to speculation in terms of interpretation there. But what we are seeing is in this area is a major 2-phase building, 1 phase of wall, 2nd phase of wall, which is aisled and extended in its 2nd phase, widened. We move on to the north. There is another building which is equally, or even less well preserved, but again built against the boundary wall. What we are seeing in this area, it appears, is an area of ancillary activity away from the core buildings of the site, which occupy this area here, which we're working our way towards. This building extends or buildings probably extends east-west across the site and incorporates a number of long halves. You can see there, and the next slide should show us them in more detail, several of them. These long halves are cut directly into the natural subsoil. We've got very little superstructure surviving again, and we are waiting. What we should have said, what I should have said when I started this, is that we are only now in the assessment phase of this project. We're waiting for results of an assessment of the environmental samples from these. Normally, well, in most cases, long halves, where they can actually be associated with any specific activity, are associated with grain drying, it would appear. It's not impossible, they can be put to other uses, but we certainly have little evidence from this area of the site, at least, of any evidence of metalworking or anything else. So we are probably looking at secondary, but as I say, an ancillary area in which crop processing is part of what's going on. Now, we are moving to the southeast corner of the site, the boundary wall running through there. And here we have two buildings. Unfortunately, this picture is at right angles to the alignment of this one. But in the better preserved of these two buildings, we have a large number of oven bases, in several cases superimposed one on the other. So again, we are seeing processes which are likely, we would suggest, to be associated with crop processing. These look like big bread ovens, and that has led to some speculation about what the site could be for. Speculation which is perhaps we've stepped back from slightly, but I'll deal with that later. What we can say about this building is that it was aisled. It may well have had could have had a second story, these post bases, which you see here, and there would have been more, presumably, in this area, which have been lost. Could have supported a floor of a second story, or they could be supporting something which is more like the roof of something. It's more like a barn with aisles in it. But again, we are seeing something which is on a substantial scale. These are 2 meter scales. These are large buildings. This is a large complex. A lot of resources gone into it. A lot of resources even gone into the secondary buildings, let alone those which we're going to come to later. And as I say, this is part of a separate lower terrace south of the main group of what I'm going to call for the time being domestic buildings. This is a detail which shows the several of the what we suggest are large ovens, and that is one which is a section through one. There's a lot. These ovens represent an awful lot of bread, if that was what was being made in them, for example. There is intensive use over a considerable period of time here. Now, to turn to the core of the building complex, and it is complex. We actually have 2 major construction phases with a series of sub-phases. This structure, which I'm not going to talk about yet, really, is the one that attracted all of the publicity. Central circular element with 3 rooms off it and a porch. But it overlies something which is equally interesting, but perhaps more conventional. This is the earliest element which is expanded to the south and to the north and has what looks like a conventional bath suite attached to it. This could be seen as a moderately prosperous villa house, and for Yorkshire, probably a very prosperous villa house, perhaps not as impressive as the site at Hovingham, as we understand it, but certainly akin to villas at places like Langton and Rudston. And again, we are seeing terracing. There is a terrace within this building, which happens, which is about at that point, but for reasons which are beyond us, it seems that these elements haven't actually suffered as much as some of the other elements in terms of plough damage, and we should be thankful for that. This north-south range incorporated a hypercourse which was fired. We ignore this, as you see it, that belongs to the next phase, but it reuses the location of an hypercourse occupied at least the northeastern corner of this this part of this north-south structure. Going down the slope, there is a gap in the wall here, which looks like it ought to be for the flue of another furnace, another hypercourse furnace. But there is no evidence that a hypercourse was ever installed in this room. There's no trace of peli, there's no evidence of wall jacketing or wall flues. One of the mysteries of this site is they seem to start things and not finish them, or at least not finish them in the way that you might have expected them to. The word I keep using for the site is weird, but Paula tells me the interpretation has got to, discussion chapter has got to be longer than it's weird. So we will try. Added to this north-south building is something that looks very much like a conventional bathhouse. Fuel store, furnace, location potentially for a plunge bath. Presumably the intention would have been to have a hot water tank over it. Caldarium, tepidarium, cold plunge bath, and presumably a changing room in this area as in the original plan. It's a problem in that there is again no evidence for wall jacketing, peli, or anything that suggests the hypercourse was ever completed, nor is there any evidence of the furnace area having been fired. Again, this is strange. I won't say weird. But this room did contain large quantities of tufa voussoirs, which we weren't clear at the time whether they had been brought to site with the intention of being used, or whether they represented a collapsed vault. The assessment of the ceramic building material by Dr. Phil Mills has suggested that there was at least one domed roof constructed on this site, because there are concave tiles which actually are used to act over domed roofs. So it's likely that this was roofed, but there is no evidence that it's ever used for its intended function. Failed bathhouses are not unknown. The town bathhouse at Catterick, third phase of bathhouse there, was basically completely kitted out again, except all of the paraphernalia would make it work for peli, the wall jacketing, etc. And it was used as a rubbish dump before being used for domestic occupation. It's possible that for whatever reason, this bath suite was turned over to domestic occupation, never having been used as a bath suite. There is a fire pit. So the only problem we have there is, as it's cut into natural, we don't know whether it is actually associated with the use of this room, or whether, as it was sealed by the collapsed voussoirs, whether it was something that was there before the room was constructed. Moving on. This is the bath suite. Detail of the collapsed voussoirs, indication of the quality of the masonry. This cold plunge bath has a nice drain. Problem is, it's a drain to nowhere. There is no drainage gully on the outside of the wall. It was, again, never used. Really high quality masonry in the area of what would have been presumably the hot plunge area. But it's stonework, which is better than anything else, which survives in situ on site. And what that suggests to me is being brought in somewhere else, either somewhere else on site from a pre-existing building that's been demolished, or it's being brought in as spoil from another site. We don't know, but if it's not reused, why hide your best masonry, or potentially hide your best masonry under the floor of your bathhouse? Now, moving on. The latest building, and this is definitely weird. We actually have something which has as its core this circular room here, room 1. It has a well-built, well, a fairly well-defined porch surviving here with paved, good paving, and a threshold with settings to the door. Other thresholds survive into the other rooms. But There is no floor surviving here. Room 2 to the north is of 2 phases. You can see the earlier phase, which I'll show you a photograph of it in a moment. And you can also see the expanded second phase. You have the room 3 with a hypercourse, which is not like any hypercourse I've ever seen before. And again, I'll show you photographs of that. And we also have room 4, which has a opus signinum floor, as there is in room 2. And we have an insight into this because, fortunately or unfortunately, we have a post-medieval ditch cutting through the site on that line. The problem we have is, at this stage, given the fact we haven't been able to remove walls to get firm construction dates for elements, is phasing the site. This could be contemporary with some of the ancillary buildings which I started off by describing. It could also be contemporary with this curved wall here, the remnants of a circular room or structure here. But again, we're giving this lecture too soon. We need the results of the assessment at least to be able to tie down the phasing in more detail. But what we can say is, given the location of the complex, this structure, whether or not it was single story or or 2 or more stories, would have stood out in a landscape. Its position at the eastern end of a Vale of Pickering would have basically made it stand out. Particularly if there was more of this nice bright white limestone, almost like a lighthouse at the end of the vale. I'm not suggesting it was a lighthouse, obviously, but it would have that sort of impact in the landscape. Now, this is room 2, which I mentioned with the earlier phase, slightly expanded in the second phase, opus signinum floor. This is for North East Yorkshire. This is good quality rural architecture. In fact, better than average quality rural architecture. Room 3, right. Pili constructed of limestone rubble, and in places also tufa, which presumably is excess to requirements for the vaulting of the bath suite, or reused from a bath suite, or we don't know at this stage. We're looking at the this material in assessment, but what we can say is this is of 2 phases. The preceding hypercourse had a furnace in this area here. You can see remnants of rake-out material, but in this phase of a building, there was a solid wall here, a new gap put through this wall here, presumably for a furnace. Again, no evidence of a furnace having been built, nor is there any evidence of burning within or heating within the hypercourse, unlike the reused pili at this end. So this is strange, as is the fact that if you look very carefully here, you can see that the hypercourse was infilled with soil. This involved the lifting of the stone slab floor, infilling with soil and rubble, and the relaying of a stone slab floor over that infilled material. And we know that the slabs were lifted because there is soil over the tops of the pili. The slabs do not make contact with the pili. It's not a case of it being stuff which has been washed in, pushed in, or whatever. It has actually been deliberately deposited as infilling. Paula mentioned water, and water on this site is a problem in many ways. We had far too much of it when we were digging in winter, and directing water away from a building seems to be the purpose of quite a few features, stone-lined gullies and also ditches, but also this feature, which was located to the west of the core buildings and appears to have existed from the late Iron Age onwards, appears to have actually potentially been some form of system receiving water. It produced pottery, which Paula, I believe, is going to refer to, which some of which dates to the conquest period, so it's incredibly early in the history of a site. It also produced 4th century material in higher deposits. So this was open for a very long period of time. This was at one time considered a potential focus for the site, but I'll return to that at the end. And finally, we have a very nice well, except it would have been if it had ever got to water. This, again, thankful to Dominic Cowsland for his models. This well, which is located here to the east of the core buildings, within the, if you like, the ancillary area, was extremely well defined, stepped top, cut into rock. We got down to as deep as we dared push for health and safety legislation. And then we brought in a drilling rig, and James Rackham cored that well for us, demonstrated it went down to 9.6 meters from the ground surface, Roman period ground surface, at which point it hit rock which the drilling rig could not go through. And basically, the well was, if you like, failed. It was never completed. Paula did mention potential reasons for a site being abandoned. It may go from too much water to too little water, but we'll return to that function later. But what we do know from James's analysis of the fills is the well was left to fill up naturally. It was not deliberately backfilled. So as an event, it seems likely to belong to late in the site's history. And at that point, I think it's back to Paula.
And hot off the press from Dominic, I think it was at 2 o'clock this afternoon, he phoned to say that he thinks that well and it going out of use could be quite significant in terms of the site. But then going back to the background of HA2, you can imagine our shock when we came into HA1. HA2 was assessed as a basic level Roman site, similar to when Martin's Point Phil Mills had looked at the pottery as well. And then we faced with HA1. And so as Pete has wonderfully described the architecture of the site, we can't tell you most of the building's functions. Are we ever going to be able to tell you what this site was all about? Well, it's over to the specialists, and the initial impressions that are coming through from the assessment is they're as perplexed as we are, which is, well, it's a bit heartening, really, because it really has been a very interesting site to work on. And I am very, very grateful for Pete's help through this and Dominic's. And these are just some of the points that I think that we should be looking at in terms of what this site is about. And other people may disagree with me, but I just think the finds are emerging trends that are coming out of the assessment. The Neolithic flint axes and flint scatters are located across the area and incorporated into buildings. And these principally utilitarian items from the Neolithic period are found in place within Roman deposits. And they're frequently assigned that curation of the axe. But I think we should be looking at other examples in the area of Roman buildings incorporating greenstone axe. And I think it's definitely an area that we should be looking to research, just in terms of what's been happening in Brittany, looking at Neolithic sites that have Roman deposits on, and vice versa. Why are these greenstone axes appearing in Roman buildings? So that's one of the things. And then possibly we may see some understanding in the significance of the site. Also, there's little doubt that the site had a late Iron Age foundation with finds of pottery, including the neck of the Dressel 2-4 amphora, which he had pointed out, and weaving combs and an early Hod Hill brooch. That's thanks to Hilary, and that's another thing that has just come out in the last few days. Hilary Cool has come out with saying, you know, she cannot understand some of the finds depositions on the site, what's in the finds. So if Hilary doesn't know, that's another point that we're probably not going to know as well. But not insignificant finds for a northern settlement is what Hilary is saying. And whilst we'll be able to describe peripheral Iron Age activity as illustrated in HA2, in HA1 we're not going to really be able to tell you because we didn't excavate. So the foundations of the site we're not going to know. And that limits our understanding. Unfortunately, like the antiquaries at Silchester, we may have to admit defeat in understanding the reasons why the site developed in the Iron Age into such an unusual complex of buildings. And these are just a few of the finds at the moment. We've got pottery going through to 410 and stops on, with the Cranbeck. We've got painted wall plaster, so definitely these rooms, some of the rooms at least, were finished and decorated. We have very unusual ironwork. Coins generally tend to be late 3rd into the 4th. The girth bangles are unusual in terms of Hilary saying that what you would expect to be green, turquoise are turning out to be blue, which she thinks may actually be quite significant in itself. And the copper alloy brooches we have here, we have this early 1st century hairpin and an enamel brooch here. And then one of the exceptional finds is this gridiron, and it's a rare discovery in Roman Britain. And they tend to be a part of a deliberate structured deposition. Something similar may be the case here, as it appears the gridiron was placed face down in the pit with at least 2 other items placed on top. The structured deposition of iron objects and hoards is a phenomenon of interest in Roman British studies. So that could be a significant find in terms of what it's going to tell us about the site. And then we have a repoussé brooch of, it's currently a unique find, and it's again of national and possible international importance. And Hilary has stated that it's definitely worthy of further consideration. So it shouldn't be overlooked, the significance of this find. And what she also says is, whilst it would be wrong to consider most brooches as badges conveying a particular type of identity, this large imposing piece with its diademed head is probably an exception to that rule. Further work on the iconography of the piece may well cast light on the type of individual who might have worn it, and in consequence help identify who might have been living at Eastfield or at least visiting it. So watch this space on that one. And the querns have been assessed, and the querns have been incorporated into surfaces, and the assemblage is of regional importance again. We have no lava querns, ruling out that another piece of evidence to rule out possible military link. But I think, you know, we need to do more in the assessment of that. We've got millstones that would have driven water mills, and that is the possibility because of the local stream, and we've seen from the ditches and everything. And the quality of the various querns suggests that Eastfield occupants had access to a better quality of stone resources than those accessible to the Thring inhabitants, so giving it that higher status once again. To the north of the building complex, we have various kilns, industrial processing pits, and the analysis stage hopefully will elucidate these processes and what has been undertaken on the site. In HA1, we definitely have industrial processes. These features are much closer to the buildings. And this is a single context included daub with wattle impressions, and was derived from a substantial wattle and daub structure, possibly with doming. and further evidence for pottery production is provided with the presence of several cylindrical, slightly tapering bars. Another really interesting thing because it has parallels with cross gates. And that this is an earlier site that was excavated at 2.8 kilometres away from this site. And at the time of excavation, the C14 date came back as the earliest kiln in the north of Britain. So I think we need to be examining the movement of sites. That sites appear to finish in the 2nd century, and it seems that Eastfield took over. So we need to be working on both those assemblages to see. The tiles have a high level of signatures, especially on the tegula, and the majority were single finger drawn, curved, and though that's another pointer, were they being manufactured close by? Their occurrence was frequent enough to suggest, if not all the tegula were marked this way, which is an unusual and may reflect an unusual method of workshop management. We also have animal prints suggesting that they were manufactured on a farm. And then back to this pottery kiln. This pottery kiln is subject for debate, isn't it, in terms of the stratigraphy at the minute. Originally, we had thought it had been put in the side of a ditch, still not ruling that out, although at the assessment stage, there's a bit of debate about this. But this slide shows this kiln in it. We'll wait for the environmental evidence, but I put it in because I think there's a link. This is the pottery kiln from Norton, Malton, that was excavated about 10 years ago. This site is published, but the C14 date from the fill came back as the late 1st century, although the Norton pottery production is always pushed into the 2nd, 3rd. So are we looking at potential rejigging of the Norton pottery manufacturing? But that's all for the future. And then back over to Pete.
Thank you, Paula. Dating Paula's already mentioned, and we've indicated we're happy what we've got late Iron Age, but the question is when. There is evidence that the site was deliberately taken out of the landscape, in that there is very little evidence of robbing. The only real evidence of robbing is in this area here, where there is a large intrusion into the site. Elsewhere, where there's not been ploughed away, the walls appear to be consistently taken down, and obviously the stone removed, presumably for reuse. But if they were robbing the site, why stop where they did? Particularly when you have the quality of masonry that we saw in the Bath Suite. So something strange is happening in terms of how a site is removed from a landscape. It is not totally a result of plan. I would suggest it is not generally a result of what I would call uncaring robbing. Let's rip the stone out, take it away and use it. And that led us to wonder whether the site may be have some, I don't know, be some form of ritual site, have some religious significance, a way of taking it out of the landscape to stop these nasty Christians desecrating it or whatever. But that is perhaps contradicted by the pottery, which at least on the basis of the assessment appears to continue to the end of pottery supply in Roman Britain. And similarly, the small finds are suggesting, again, there's late use of the site, or at least late presence on the site, because again, late 4th century into the 5th century is something that Hilary is quite confident about in the way she puts it. But that's and the mount which so I'm trying to get to my notes, which is not letting me do. Oh well, so excuse me. but the mount which Paula showed a picture of actually and the strap end, both can be dated to the late 4th to 5th century. Rather surprisingly, though, given the limitations on the excavations, the balance of the small finds assemblage is towards the 1st and 2nd century. Okay, a lot of that material probably came from areas away from the core buildings, but that does raise issues about certainly what buildings go together in terms of phasing, what the unknown buildings which presumably exist under those two phases of stone buildings, what date they are and what function they are. The ceramic building material suggests two major phases of construction for the stone buildings, late 2nd into the 3rd century and late 3rd century. Does this actually date the two main stone elements we're seeing? But we know that the latest buildings is of two phases, at least in part. There are questions there. And but a big question in terms of dating is, how does the core complex, which we have had to work around, relate to the rest of the site? And that leads us on to function. We could be fairly confident, given the presence of the contact stroke pre-conquest materials such as the Dressel 2-4 amphora that Paula showed, and the long-lived metal trackway. We've got a high status Iron Age site. Does that status carry on through into the Roman period? Are we seeing something which it basically sees a continuation of the social order which was there in the Iron Age? A religious or military function was floated by various people when the site was first discovered, but Hilary is adamant that the finds provide no overt evidence for either military involvement in the site or specific religious practices other than structured deposition, which is, I think, generally accepted as something you'd expect on most, many, if not most, Roman sites. The north-south range and the Bath Suite, and presumably with some of the ancillary buildings, could be seen as a moderately prosperous villa, and for that part of Yorkshire, quite remarkable for being so. There are a few substantial sites. I've mentioned Langton and I've mentioned Rudston, and there's the large villa at Hovingham. But the latest building is unparalleled in Roman Britain, and we're struggling to find parallels anywhere in the Western provinces. And the original, sorry, I've just gone too far. The removal of the landscape, of the building from the landscape, led me to fantasize about it being a Julianic pagan revival site, which would have been quite nice. Its dating for the latest building could fit with that, but we have no religious material to support that. But equally, the longevity of the site, potentially into the 5th century, does also cause a problem there, although we do know that sites such as such religious sites can run quite late. In terms of the form of the buildings, the late Anthony Beeson suggested the garden suite, an open courtyard surrounded by 5 rooms and accessed by a porch at Abdica, which I'll probably pronounce wrong, near Lagos in Portugal, as a possible parallel, along with the Chedworth Capitol, which has been reconstructed as an enclosed shrine or mausoleum with side chambers, but neither exactly parallel the Eastfield structure. And the Portuguese example, I would suggest, ought to be discounted. An open garden in North Yorkshire, which surrounded by rooms with no evidence of drainage through or under them, doesn't seem to work for me. I live there, and I don't fancy it at all. It just would not work. the Yorkshire weather would not be kind. Similarly, the inclusion of a hypercourse in room 3 would suggest it's not a mausoleum or a shrine. And also the fact that that building, most of the elements were at least were rebuilt or extended or significantly repaired. So it seems more likely to have had some form of domestic function, or in some way perhaps operated as a detached group of reception rooms. But that leaves the open question about what elements of the site were associated with it at that time. Other colleagues, including our president, Tony King, Tony King, who's here, and I also saw John Crichton at one point, but I don't know if he's actually in the room still, along with Janet Delane, Roger Wilson, Simon Desmond Cleary, have all been incredibly helpful making suggestions, and it's been greatly appreciated. But it is fair to say that most of the potential parallels which have been suggested form elements of larger structures, and therefore, again, they don't provide a parallel for Eastfield directly. Doesn't mean they should be discounted, but it does mean we have a major mystery on our hands. And at that point, I'll hand back to Paula.
I will just quickly sum up really in terms of reporting. One of the issues that we have is in North Yorkshire, Yorkshire as a whole, is that we don't have a research agenda to hang sites and what we're going to turn at in terms of significance of findings. And Eastfield is such an important site, but I think in its wider landscape, we're not really understanding this end of the Vale of Pickering. Dominic's work, he sorted out West Heselton, but we really need to now, from the late Iron Age into the Roman period, start to understand Eastfield with Crossgates, Staxton Fort, and how it all interrelates. And maybe we'll come up with some other suggestions in terms of what's happening at Eastfield in the future. And then just finally, it's thanks to all the people that have helped us, especially Alistair Cross and Martin Thomas, who led the team of archaeologists on site, and Martin Millett and Dominic for all their help, and obviously Pete, who's actually part of the team, really. So thank you very much. And if anyone can help us out, we've just put our emails on, and we'd be very grateful for any suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete and Paula, for that. I was privileged to visit the site on several occasions and discuss what it means on the ground. And I think all of us who've been involved in it are still mystified by it. So this is one of those occasions where I think the discussion in the room here from people with different interpretations of views could be very, very helpful indeed. If I could sort of start the discussion with a comment, and which may lead to a question. One of the things with that very odd late structure with the rooms off the circle, when I first saw it, I think as I showed with Paula, I was pushing examples of Roman architecture in the Mediterranean and the sort of Villa Maritima type complex. And I'm sure you're right that the disengagement of this from a larger complex sort of rules out those types of parallels. But what is increasingly striking for me about it is that it looks like a hybrid between Northern European, if you like, Iron Age tradition of roundhouse built in stone with a Mediterranean tradition of Roman architecture. And the circular building is definitely not a Roman form of architecture. And I wonder whether there's something around that hybridity which might not explain the site, but at least needs folding in, because we're almost seeing the Iron Age style round building with the Roman style dining tradition sort of fitted off it, if I can put it that way.
Thank you, Martin. I wouldn't, on one level, I wouldn't argue with that at all. And there are obviously the other round buildings on site. However, it's an interesting sequence in that it seems to have inserted into the sequence what you could see as a conventional Roman Yorkshire upmarket villa house. So in terms of the social implications of that, at this stage, I haven't got a clue. I think that's probably be brutally honest about it. But we also know that at sites like Beedlam, there are circular and ovoid buildings of a late date. So there is, as Paula was saying, about things which need to be looked at in a much wider context. That is certainly true. But I think, without saying, well, I certainly wouldn't even dream of saying you're wrong, but I'd certainly say we need to go a long way to come close to even saying the verdict's not proven, let alone true, correct.
Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating presentation. And I had the pleasure of being at the seminar that was organized online several months ago, as you mentioned. And I think I've ended up being as mystified as you are after this evening. I started out, I suppose, by thinking, well, if that was a circular building on its own, one would, as Martin has just said, perhaps go along the Roman development out of an Iron Age tradition. I myself have been involved with an excavation on Hayling Island of just such a structure, which takes a circular shrine of the Iron Age and is developed in the Roman period. But it's the addition of the other buildings on each side. Now, you do see that in the Mediterranean, in certain circumstances, the presence of dietae, I suppose pleasure rooms, if you like, at certain villas like Desenzano at Lake Garda. But you've got to have the rest of the structure there somewhere, and this appears to be on its own, and that's what leads me to be mystified, really, as mystified as you are, as I said earlier. And where is the rest of the what you might call if it's a part of a villa, where is the rest of the building in the later phase? We seem to have that circular building and the 3 rooms around it and the semicircular one just to its south on its own. And that's what provides the questions for the future as to exactly what was going on.
The other element that I think is worth thinking about, do we have any indication yet of whether the big aisle buildings are there with the circular structure? Because one of the, they're big aisle buildings, which I see as communal. The impression I got when we were on site and reinforced by your sort of tour today is that they are different in their contents. We've got ovens in one and so forth. And they could fit into a concept of a centre that is where people come periodically once a year, whatever, and they're being fed and watered and so forth for sort of gatherings around seasonal fair or whatever. But that depends on the contemporaneity or otherwise of the structures.
It's fair to say at the moment, but we're still working on that question as the specialist assessments come in, because we don't have the horizontal stratigraphy that links things, as you're obviously well aware. Seasonal use of the site was something which we were very keen on, particularly given the concentration of bread ovens, thinking perhaps having to feed a lot of people as you suggest, at a particular point in time. But that was fine when we were trying to hang a religious function on it. And in the absence of the evidence of any significant religious evidence related to the site, I'm struggling, but I do wonder whether, in fact, the religious focus, if there were one, was not on site, but possibly on Ivers Mount, which would be a very obvious location. As I say, unfortunately, it has a motor racing circuit on it, so we're never likely to find out. And to the best of my knowledge, there are no records of any finds from the area come. But if it's not a religious function, you have the idea of it being a location for a fair. I struggle with, because you have something which is quite defined, and the fair would have to happen in large part, I would suggest, outside the complex. Now, that's not impossible, but and Tony's about to tell me there are parallels for that. It seems to me that we, at this stage, still have a fairly blank sheet of paper with some notes at the bottom which are worth exploring.
The environmental information, and we haven't got those results yet. It's going to be really interesting in terms of looking at function of buildings, you know, then we may be able to describe what activities were going on in each building, and that may illuminate what the site's about. But we're just going to have to wait, aren't we, and hope that we actually get that.
I mean, I like the idea of a seasonal usage and possibly a place where people went perhaps on pilgrimage or something like that, visiting from somewhere else. And I think that there are probably a number of sites in Britain where you can argue for that quite well. There is one site in the north which I think might be worth looking at, and that's Maryport. Because for two buildings at Maryport, which were excavated and reported on recently by Tony Wilmot, Ian Haynes, they are on a map, you know, on a high position above the vicus and the fort, and there is a circular building there, of course. And they talk in terms of alignments and that sort of thing. So maybe some investigation of alignments on your site might be quite interesting as well.
Thank you, Tony. That's certainly worth pursuing.
Hi, thanks. Did you say it was scheduled to site?
Shall we say it is in progress?
In progress, yeah.
We were told very firmly to stop digging the core bits because there's an agreement in place between the developers, Scarborough Borough Council, for the areas that were going to be preserved in situ. To accredit to Keep Mode Homes, they consolidated all of the green space in the development and gave up an additional, I think it was 11 house plots to ensure there was enough space to protect the core buildings. But Historic England are still going through the legal niceties of scheduling.
But there'll be a sort of management plan as part of the scheduling.
Well, I assume so, but I'm no longer part of Historic England, so I don't.
No, quite.
I'm not involved in that. That's
I should explain. Pete and I both worked for English Heritage at one point. Is there going to be any chance within that, I wonder, to do a bit more excavation to find out?
Unfortunately, that's what we were hoping.
Yeah.
That we would be able to excavate more, because I think walking away from it, you know, normally when you walk away from a site, you're happy that you've done a really thorough job and you understand it as much as you thought you could. But this one has sort of left that feeling of, well, we don't really understand, and you know, to stand up and say, hey, it's the most amazing site. Well, we can't really tell you what it is, what its function is, and where it sits in that whole landscape. And it really is a significant addition to knowledge. And there's more, and you know, these sites that are popping up that we didn't know about.
Yeah.
You know, how does it all interrelate? You know. So yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Yeah. Don't you just love archaeology?
I think it's fair to say that Paula's point about the importance of a specialist assessment is it's crucial to how we take the analysis phase of this forward, because we can only do so much of the structures because we run up against the edge of the what will be the scheduled area. And I think the post-excavation, this is going to be led by the potential that the specialists identify. Obviously, yes, we're going to do what we can with the site per se, but in terms of understanding, it's going to be reliant very heavily, or is this just shifting responsibility on the specialists?
We need to start plotting fines as well into individual buildings, hopefully.
But there are no more interventions from the floor. Can we thank Paula and Pete for giving us some mystery to concentrate on? And I must say, I would be much more upbeat than you are about what you have said and can say about the site. Don't underplay it. But thank you very much indeed. Can we thank our speakers? And I give notice that the next meeting will be an out of London meeting in York on Thursday, the 24th of November, when we will hear a paper, Our Council in the North, Reflections and Future Research Directions at the King's Manor, by Dr. Kate Giles.